There's a person who has been coming to this room for a long time. I want to be careful about how I describe them, because what I'm going to say could sound like a criticism, and it isn't. It's closer to an account of something I've watched happen to someone, something done to them, gradually, across more years than either of us would have chosen. When they first came here, they were engaged in the way that's genuinely rare. Not loud about it, not performing an identity, just paying attention. They read things and thought about them. They could hold an argument they disagreed with long enough to find what was true in it. They asked questions that didn't already contain the answer. I noticed them early, the way you notice someone whose attention is real rather than demonstrated. They cared about how the country was run, not abstractly, specifically. Who made decisions, how those decisions got made, what happened to people when the decisions were wrong. They believed, I think, that the system was trying. Imperfectly, noisily, with more ego and less competence than anyone would design for. But trying. Genuinely oriented toward the thing it was supposed to be doing. I've watched that belief run out. Not all at once. The way it happened matters as much as the fact that it did. The first reshuffle of the government I watched them respond to. They came in the day after with something like renewed attention. A new face at the top. A different register, a different background, a different set of words for the same set of problems. They sat with it seriously, asked what this might change, listened to the answers other people gave, left still thinking. The second reshuffle, a few years later, they came in quieter. Still engaged, but something in the engagement had a different quality. A slight bracing, a preparedness not to be surprised. They didn't ask what might change. They waited to see. By the third, they didn't mention it, because what they'd watched across those years was the face change and the problems stay. The name above the door replaced, the same structural forces waiting on the other side of it. The announcement made outside the building, the serious expression, the careful language, the promise that this time the approach would be different. And then the same approach, because the approach was never really chosen. It was inherited. From the forces that don't move in 5 years, or 10, or 15. They'd work that out themselves, without being told, just from watching closely enough for long enough. For a while, that understanding made them angry. Not the loud kind. This wasn't a person who performed their feelings. But there was a period, somewhere in the middle of all this, when they came through that door carrying a sharper energy than before. A frustration that knew where to point itself. They'd look at the latest announcement, the reframing, the relaunched strategy, the same commitment dressed in new language, and something would tighten around the eyes. They'd say something precise and cutting to whoever was nearest, and then stop, because the words were right, but saying them didn't help. That's the phase before weariness, when you still believe the system could be different, still feel the gap between what it is and what it was supposed to be as an affront rather than a fact. The anger is, in its way, a form of faith. It means you haven't stopped expecting better. But anger needs somewhere to land, and theirs had nowhere. I watched it return to them each time a little heavier, with nothing in the room to absorb it. And I watched them begin to feel what it was costing. What I watched change wasn't their intelligence or their care. Both remained. What changed was their relationship to the performance of it all. Because somewhere across those years they'd understood, not as a theory, but as something lived, something they'd arrived at through accumulated disappointment, that what they'd been watching wasn't quite what they'd thought it was. The chamber wasn't primarily a place where problems got solved. It was a place where points got scored. The dispatch box wasn't a lectern for policy. It was a pitch. The campaign wasn't a conversation with the country about what needed doing. It was a contest, with winners and losers, and a crowd kept loud enough that nobody looked too carefully at what was actually on offer. The crowd was supposed to be the point of it. Instead, the crowd had become the fuel for it. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, the energy required to keep engaging with it as if it's what it claims to be becomes energy you don't have. Not because you've stopped caring about the thing underneath, the actual decisions, the actual people they land on, but because the gap between the performance and the substance has grown wide enough that engaging with the performance feels like cheering for the right side in a contest that wasn't going to change the underlying thing either way. That's when the weariness arrived, not as a choice, as a conclusion. This isn't apathy. The person I'm describing still comes to the room, still listens, still, when something genuine breaks through the surface of a conversation, leans forward slightly in the way they always did. The care is still there. What's gone is the belief that the official channels of the thing they care about are oriented toward what they care about. And that's a reasonable thing to have concluded. That's the part that stays with me from this wall. The weariness wasn't a failure of character or stamina. It was the accurate reading of someone who paid close enough attention for long enough. The system produced this response in this person by being consistently and across enough time exactly what it revealed itself to be. The noise did this, not the problems, the performance of the problems. The perpetual contest, the scorekeeping, the crowd kept hot and divided and pointed at itself, while the structural forces that actually shape a life continued at their own pace, indifferent to the result. I watched them come in last week. There'd been another announcement. The room had the particular sound it gets when people are deciding whether to believe something. That slightly effortful quality, the processing happening just below the conversation. This person sat down, said nothing for a while, and then they asked something. Not a statement dressed as a question, a real one. The kind that starts from not knowing, pointing at the actual thing rather than the performance of it. Said quietly to the person next to them. I don't think they noticed they'd done it, but I did. It was the question of someone who still has the capacity for that. I'll still be here when you get back.